Syria's war has been raging for over a decade now, with no end still in sight. And well, it's complicated, and that's like the understatement of the year. There's dozens of different sides with different ideologies, different religions, and different visions for Syria's future. Let's delve into this never-ending conflict. Hopefully I don't make you too depressed. In late January, peaceful protests began throughout Syria demanding an end to Bashar al-Assad's rule in the country. These were inspired by the so-called Arab Spring, a series of protests in Middle Eastern Arab countries against absolute monarchies and long-term presidents.
Syrians now demanding what Tunisians and Egyptians have just won, and Libyans are currently fighting for: wholesale political reform.
On Tuesday, March the 15th, 2011, uprisings break out in the capital city of Damascus as people's demands had still not been met. In July, the protesters arm themselves and some of the Syrian army joins them to form the Free Syrian Army, a group that wants to remove Bashar al-Assad from the presidency. The situation now descends into a civil war. The rest of 2011 was basically the Syrian rebel groups making gains all throughout western Syria. 2012 was the rebels making even more gains. In mid-2012, Syria's Kurdish population living in the north and northeastern parts of the country take territory, as large parts of the Syrian government army retreat to defend major Syrian cities, such as the capital city Damascus in the west, after rebels attempt to take it. This also allows the rebels to take even more territory in the northwest of the country. Also in 2012, they take more territory, but this time in the southeast. However, they fail to take the key city of Deir ez-Zur, which manages to hold out against the rebels. Now 2013 is a decisive year in the conflict, as it isn't just the rebels versus the Syrian government local war anymore, mainly due to one group: ISIS. But before we get into that, I need to explain this as well. It's important to note that not all of the rebels are moderates and want to just overthrow Assad and create a democratic Western-friendly state, but rather many are extremists themselves and are considered terrorist groups by certain nations, so as soon as they achieve their main aim of removing Assad, the whole rebel alliance will soon fall apart, like in Libya, and Syria will go back to war to remove these individual groups, and this creates other problems. So when the US starts arming many of these rebels, due to it also believing Assad should leave, unaware to it, many of its own weapons end up in these radical rebel Syrian groups which despise them. So anyway, back to ISIS. In early April 2013, ISIS splits with Al-Qaeda, another terrorist organisation, and begins taking its own territory throughout Iraq and, more importantly for our story, Syria, committing atrocity after atrocity, rallying the world against it. Soon, the US, which had only really just started supplying the rebels with weapons and supplies, turned their attention to this new radical terrorist group, ISIS. Now, ISIS being a terrorist group has no real allies other than the few radical rebel groups where they have a sort of frenemy relationship. This is because there are disagreements on how they conduct the war. ISIS's vision is to create a super conservative, intolerant Islamic state and to kill all non-Muslims and fellow Muslims that do not endorse their radical interpretation of Islam. But the worst part about this group was that they were very successful at fighting. So successful in fact that their violence was spilling over in terms of territory into Lebanon, another country that tried to stay out of the conflict. Eventually, the Lebanese army would push back the terrorists, but it helped highlight other questions. Who else was starting to get involved indirectly or directly like Lebanon in Syria? Well, Iran is a strong ally of Syria. It has backed a militia group based in Lebanon and sent them to Syria to help fight ISIS and all the various factions of the rebels. Iran's main goal is a stable Syria led by Assad. However, it also has a sort of rivalry with Saudi Arabia, as both countries seek to gain influence in Syria. This is largely due to religion, with Saudi Arabia being mainly Sunni Islam and Iran being predominantly Shia Islam. The Syrian government also has another strong ally though. To the north, Russia supports Assad by bombing some rebels, including some backed by the US, and most importantly ISIS fighters. Its goal is also to try to keep Assad in power, as it has significant economic interests in Syria, but most importantly it has two military bases, the naval facility of Tartus and the airbase of Khmeim. If Russia can keep Syria as stable as possible, then Russia can defend these interests. While neighbouring Iraq was involved indirectly by sending money and weapons to the Syrian government, It soon became directly involved when ISIS rose up along its borders and into its territory in early 2013. I'll probably do a separate video on the Iraq War fairly soon if you want it, but all you need to know is that Iraq helped drive out ISIS from their nation in 2017 and then helped the Syrians by bombing ISIS with Syrian government permission in eastern Syria as well. Neighbouring Israel is kind of indirectly in the war for its occupation of parts of Syria, the Golan Heights, which was due to a war many decades before. It has also sent humanitarian aid to the Syrians as well. So what about the Gulf states? Well, the UAE, the Saudis and other Arab nations are all friendly to the rebels and have supplied many weapons, some even to extremists. This is because they want to see the removal of his regime, largely due to him having ties with Iran, and again that's mainly due to the Middle Eastern Cold War. Speaking of Cold War, there is another Cold War but between the Western countries. Let me explain. Britain, France and the USA also want to remove Bashar al-Assad and replace him with moderate rebels that won't be a training ground for terrorists. However, this is what Russia opposes, and thus this brings everyone back to the times of the Cold War when the countries were locked in tensions back at the time. The West has armed and trained rebels, some of whom have actually been extremists unfortunately, whilst Russia has been largely bombing them to help keep Assad in power. Now, to understand Turkey's role in the war, and it's probably the most complicated, we need to continue the timeline of the Syrian civil war. So at the start of the conflict, Turkey diplomatically supported the rebels, but as time went on, relations between the Syrian government and Turkey got even worse, and soon Turkey was harbouring many moderate Syrian rebels within its borders. At the same time, millions of Syrian refugees were settling in Turkey, and the Turkish government was receiving very little financial support from other countries. And so it wanted a way to get rid of them, but in a safe area within Syria. Meanwhile, Turkey is also fighting an ongoing insurgency in eastern Turkey against the rebel Kurdish group seeking independence from Turkey. And so seeing the Kurds win battle after battle and become stronger and stronger in northern Syria made Turkey anxious, as it was worried the Syrian Kurds were also seeking independence from Syria and cooperating with this group in Turkey. And so unable to bear this any longer, in 2016 it directly intervened in the conflict, invading this last piece of northern Syria to expel ISIS, but at the same time to achieve its other objectives, to stop the Syrian Kurds from linking up and to resettle many of these Syrians in northern Syria. However, there was one final problem. The US has troops in northern Syria to guard the Turkish border, and so it couldn't take any more territory as its invasion could harm the US troops in the area. However, in 2019, the US President Donald Trump decided to move out of Syria, abandoning the Kurds, a major ally to the US, and allowing Turkey to attack them to expand this zone that it controls, so it can settle even more Syrians. The invasion was incredibly chaotic as it forced the Kurds to weaken their overstretched army who was helping guard prisons and camps, and this invasion has allowed many ISIS prisoners to unfortunately escape. And that's one of the major problems with this conflict. It's very much a multi-sided war with so many different countries directly/indirectly involved, and all of them seem to have differing views on not only the conflict, but in how to direct the war. And it's caused such a massive divide throughout not only the Middle East, but the whole world. Finally, the new US President Joe Biden has helped reshape the conflict even more. He's said to be concerned about pulling out even more troops from Syria, as he criticised former President Donald Trump for doing so in the past. He has recently launched an airstrike on an Iranian-backed militia group in eastern Syria in late February of 2021. And there are allegations he wants to do another airstrike, but stopped it at the last moment upon hearing of innocent women and children at another site he wishes to strike. And that's easily the biggest problem in this war: civilians. No matter how long this conflict goes on, Syria's innocent civilian population continues to suffer. With all these actors involved, it's sadly hard to see a solution to this conflict anytime soon. Hopefully this video helped explain each of the country's roles in Syria. This conflict was just so much deeper than I thought when researching this video. I tried so hard to put as much information as I possibly could, but it's just so complicated. It's really hard to make informative videos such as these. So please, if you did like this video, leave it a like and share it. My channel is tiny, as you can see, and to put all this effort in and for very few people to see it is disappointing. Feel free to leave any comments if I did miss anything out. Like I said, I'll try to make a part 2 of an Iraq explained war which is also linked to this war, but it'll take a while, and only if obviously you want to see it as well. I'll hopefully see you in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching this video.